Travel and Things presents In Conversation With. I'm your host, David Batsoffen, and today my guest is the author of this book, Cradle of Life, the story of the Magaliesberg and the cradle of humankind, and that's Vincent Carruthers. Vincent, how are you doing?
Hello, David. Nice to talk to you.
It has been a long while. You were always Mr.
Yeah.
Frog and frogging to me, but you've moved on. This is another string to your bow that I wasn't quite aware of.
Yeah, no, well, I dabble in all sorts of things. The frog work goes way back to the 1970s, actually, when I started working with Neville Passmore, who was the then professor of zoology at Wits. And he and I did a lot of work together. And then later I teamed up with Louis Dupree, and I think that's the book that you reviewed, or
Yeah.
you talked to me about quite a few years ago. I still do little bits and pieces of work with Louis. But you know, the science has moved on, and for amateurs, it's quite difficult. You have to really have access to a fancy laboratory and DNA sequencing and goodness knows what. So I'm really on the peripherals of the zoology field now. But the cradle area interests me. Wildlife generally is a huge interest in my life, and I've written quite a lot about that. So that's how I ended up writing about the Magaliesberg region, where we had a property for a while.
Well, we'll chat to that in a moment, but I remember phoning you. I was living in a townhouse at the time, and I just put in a large pond. And I said to you, I want to put some frogs in the pond. What should I put? And you told me in no uncertain terms, don't, because your neighbors will kill you if you put certain types of frogs and toads in there that are going to keep the dawn chorus going from, forget roosters at 6 o'clock. These things start much earlier than that.
They do, and they go all night. Actually, there's a flip side to that, of course, and I get calls from people who say, I've got toads croaking outside my bedroom window. They're driving me mad. What should I do? And the only answer to that is that you can't do anything, because they choose where they want to be, and if they like your fish pond or your water feature or whatever it is, they're going to stay there. And even if you move them out, they'll come back, or other ones will come back. So they've got a mind of their own.
They do indeed. Our current garden, unfortunately, I filled one pond with tadpoles, but there was a bit of a mass genocide from the Hardy-Dars next door. And they thought I'd brought Mr. Delivery to their doorstep, and they cleaned out every last tadpole.
That's expected, yes.
So talk to us about the book. It's much more, and I see it was published in 2019, so you got in just before the pandemic.
Yes.
So, and it's much more than just the cradle, because you cover so many interesting topics. The one that was of interest to me, and I think we can start at the back if you don't mind and work forward, is the dam wall at Hardebeespoort Dam.
Yeah, well, this whole region, and I'll come to the dam in a minute, because it is an exceptionally interesting story. But this whole region is unbelievably fascinating, and that's really the origin of this book, because in one area, just that little piece of ground, territory between Pretoria and Rustenburg, about 100 kilometers long and 50 kilometers wide, the entire story of life on the planet has been told in the environment. You can actually see evidence of how life evolved, how it generated, and so on. And it works right through from the very beginnings of time to right up until the modern era, the 21st century. The dam itself is an incredible story, because, of course, it was built as a post-war effort by the British, by then it was the Union of South African Government, to try and reconstruct the damage that had been done by the South African War. What a lot of people talk about the Boer War, we now use the term the South African War. And that had absolutely decimated the countryside in the Magaliesberg region. The farms had been burnt by the British, the land was devastated, and so on. And they tried to reconstruct infrastructure to recreate or to rebuild that area. And the dam was one of the big efforts to do so. And what a lot of people don't know is that it wasn't just a dam for irrigation purposes. It was a dam to create employment and work for poor whites. And of course, there was a very strong racial bias in those days. The government was concerned only with poor whites. There were very many poor black people as well, of course, but they were not included in this endeavor because whites were voters and poor whites would be bad voters for the government. So they initiated this dam. It was first surveyed in 1905, almost immediately after the war. The whole of the Crocodile River Valley was surveyed. They wanted to find a good spot to build a big irrigation scheme and to create employment. But all sorts of things got in the way. There was just the negotiations to unionize the 4 provinces into the Union of South Africa that was. That took the time of the politicians, and there was no effort put into getting the dam going. Then came the First World War, but as soon as that was declared, and as soon as South Africa joined into the First World War, of course, a lot of Boers, Afrikaners, rebelled, and there was the 1914 rebellion. And it was the Magaliesberg region was a hotspot for that particular rebellion. General Beyers assembled his rebel army just about 10 kilometers away from where the dam eventually was built. And so that stopped the dam being built. Then the next problem was the 1918 flu. And goodness, we know how that works these days. And that actually closed the works, pardon me, that closed the works down for about 6 months. They couldn't do anything. Then they had a big law case because the dam wall crosses from one farm and onto another, and it requires an act of parliament to build the dam, and the act hadn't included the other side of the river. So, and that guy held out for 2 years. He had court cases and goodness knows what. They had to pass a second act of parliament to include this guy and to expropriate him. So that slowed things down. Eventually, in about 1920, they got building. And whammo, we had in 1920, I believe, the biggest flood that there has ever been in the region. It washed away all of the works, and they started all over from scratch in 1921. Now, bear in mind that date, 1921. It's a centenary this year of the beginning of the Hartbeespoort Dam. So it's quite a significant moment that you and I are talking about the dam, because it's just 100 years since they started laying the foundations. And then there was a huge pressure to complete the dam, and a guy called Frederick Scott became the engineer. The other engineer had resigned, a poor guy, he'd given up.
Not surprised.
No, he'd had a terrible time, and now Scott took over, and in just 2 years, between 1921 and 1923, he built that, or his engineers built that whole dam. And it is a remarkable piece of work, because it's not a normal dam wall. It was a very avant-garde kind of an engineering structure. I won't go into all the detail of why that is, but it is actually unique in the way it is built. The dam wall doesn't actually cross the whole gorge. It stops 3/4 of the way across, and then there is a slipway. So it's a complicated thing. And the dam wall got built in 1923. Cars went over the top of it for the first time. They drove over the road, and that was fine. Now, this employment scheme for poor whites, you had a hell of a lot of poor white guys who now had nothing to do. And what were they going to do now? Well, the scheme was expanded with 2 massive canals that carry the water from the dam across for a distance of about 50 kilometers into the bushveld. And irrigated out of those canals were a whole lot of plots, and indigent farmers were put on the plots. They had actually no idea how to farm. They were mostly ignorant and very poor. And they were put under an incredible system that would be intolerable in modern society. They were put like schoolboys under a disciplinary system that not only taught them how to farm, but it also taught them basic hygiene and how to live their lives properly. And the 1920s, with all the flappers, and the girls were wearing their skirts short. Well, they were not allowed to wear short skirts on these farms. And they had inspectors who would come and tell you that your daughter was misbehaving and all that kind of stuff. But those farms prospered, and some of them more than others. And now, of course, it is a very big agricultural area. So that dam has got a fantastic history. It's a wonderful story. It's got all of the ingredients, good and bad, of South African history. The racism is there in abundance. The pre Second World War kind of social engineering that went on is there for us to see. But also there's the capital improvement and the infrastructure and the benefit economically that it brought to the region. Then the history goes on, and I must just finish. I can see I'm talking too much.
No, it's fine. I'm fascinated by this sort of stuff.
The end result is rather a sad story, because it became very popular, and all these fancy homes were built on the banks of the Hartbeespoort Dam. People had yachts on their backyard and so on. And then the population pressure in Johannesburg sent down effluent into the river, into the Crocodile River, and of course that has polluted the dam dreadfully. It's one of the worst cases of eutrophication in the world. So from an engineering marvel, it has turned into an engineering nightmare of how to get rid of this.
And if you drive over the dam now, over that the new road, over the far side of the dam, the amount of water hyacinth that, I mean, you can't see the water normally, depending on which way the wind is blowing. It's frightening, and there seems to be absolutely nothing they can do about that. It's a vicious cycle. If they poison it, it falls to the bottom, forms nutrients, and gives rise to more plants, and it's just too much to remove. They'd have like cleaning out the Aegean stables. They'd be there forever.
Well, you're absolutely right. And the only solution is, well, there are two solutions. One is that it has to be cured upstream. The problem arises out of sewage disposal from Johannesburg's metropole area. So that has to be fixed. And I'm not sure that it can be, because it's it is just such an enormous problem.
But before this sorry,
I was just going to say, the other solution is the silly one that I keep telling the engineers: you need to put a big plug in the bottom, and you pull the plug out like a valve, empty the whole damn thing,
and start all over again.
Yeah.
Let's get off this rather crappy subject and move on to the beginning of the book.
Yeah.
You must have had an inordinate amount of information when you started this book. How do you, I mean, this book is bed readable, as I call it, or toilet reading, because you can take it in there with you. It's big enough to contain all the information, but it's not overly big that you need 4 table legs to turn the book into a coffee table.
Yeah. No, you're right. And I'm hugely dependent on and grateful for the assistance that I got from many people. I've got lots of people who I consider friends, and I hope they consider me one too still, because I leaned heavily on people, particularly at Wits, but other universities too. And there's a lot of expertise going on in the Magaliesberg and the Cradle area. There are the paleoanthropologists like Ron Clark and Lee Berger and all of these guys. There are archaeologists of note, some of the best in the world are working in the region. There are geneticists like Himmler, Soedal. All of them have given me a huge amount of their time and their expertise. So this book is their work much more than it is mine. I've glued together the information and the expertise of other people to an enormous extent, and I acknowledge them with extreme gratitude for having helped me in that way. But it is a remarkable region because, as I said in the beginning, it tells the whole story of life from the very, very beginnings of everything. I mean, I don't know how many people know that 4 billion years ago, the world had no land. There was no dry land. It was just a big ball of covered in water, and everything was ocean. There was no dry land at all. Right. And then tectonic plates under the sea bashed into each other and lifted a part of a tectonic plate, the very first dry land ever on the planet, and we're sitting slap in the middle of it. And the Magaliesberg is actually the very center of that Karpval craton, that piece of land that came up 4 or 3.5 billion years ago and became the first dry land. So we begin literally at the beginning in the Magaliesberg cradle region, and from there on we tell the story, and it's a chronology of what has happened on the planet all the way through.
You start at 13.8 million years ago.
Yes.
I mean, it's a number that's almost inconceivable. I can't, 2020 was probably about 13 million years in 1 year. If you
Yeah.
look at what happened in 2020 and is continuing
Yes.
in 2021, you can write a
Mm.
whole book about the Magaliesberg, the year that was a decade type of thing. But
Yeah.
you've gone past that. You look at Africa, you look at human evolution, science and engineering. We've covered the Hartbeespoort Dam, the 19th
Yeah.
century. I mean, the book is absolutely fascinating, Vincent. It really and truly is.
No, I'm glad you think so, because that it is the fascination of that region that got me stirred up. And I bought a little plot of land years and years ago, and I bought it in the Magaliesberg, and I didn't realize what I was buying. I was buying a gold mine. I don't mean literally, but intellectually. Suddenly, I started learning that this place is amazing. And we from 2006, I think we began to get this place registered as a biosphere reserve with UNESCO, so that it gets international recognition. Now that's separate from the Cradle of Humankind World Heritage Site, which is the
Okay.
core area. That's in the middle of it, but the entire region is a UNESCO biosphere, which is an area where people should be trying to live sustainably. In other words, not exhaust the natural resources that they have before those resources can renew themselves. So that's going on at the same time. And that was a long process of building the confidence of the province, and then of the national government, South African national government, and then of UNESCO, the United Nations themselves. And we got that through eventually in 2015. So it is recognized internationally as a super wonder. And I'm hoping that other people, particularly South Africans, will be really proud of this thing. We have a heritage here that is absolutely unique, not only for the human evolution, the fossil sources in the caves and those, but the whole story of life from the beginning of oxygen was first produced by photosynthesis in this valley. We've got firsts and make us sound like Texans. We've got the best and the lowest and the longest. But in fact, those superlatives are true. This place is quite staggeringly interesting.
Do you believe that there is still a lot more to be discovered? I mean, if you look at, for instance, the Kango Caves, there's still plenty more there for people to go into and that type of thing. Are we going to find the same in the Cradle of Humankind, Vincent?
Yeah, absolutely. There are literally hundreds of scientists working in the Cradle of Humankind and in the Magaliesberg archaeological sites and places like that every day. And they're all making discoveries, and they're all publishing new work and new things that they're finding. I think we haven't scratched the surface. I think this place is going to yield an enormous amount of insight into the origins of life and the origins of our country, because we haven't touched, you and I now, even on the history of the area, the Boer War history, the struggle history, the coming of democracy to South Africa. That was also prominently taking place in the Magaliesberg. So there is just such a wide scope of fields of interest, and then deeper into the evolutionary history. Wits has set up this ESI, the Evolutionary Studies Institute, which is entirely dedicated to studying the whole story of evolution, not just human evolution, but all evolution. And that institute is bringing out incredible work. So the answer to your question is an absolutely undoubted yes. This place is going to be important for a very, very long time.
There's talk about job security.
Yes, absolutely. Become a paleontologist and go and work you'll have a job for life.
What I didn't know is that the one area that they've been excavating, the platform around that is an award-winning design.
Yes, that is an extraordinary structure. I only saw it about, I suppose, about 3 or 4 years ago for the first time. And it is, I don't know whether I can describe it verbally for your listeners and viewers, but basically, yes, turn up the picture. It's
I'm just
like a
trying to
sort
see
of,
what page. Do you remember what page it's on?
I've got the book here somewhere too. I don't know that I can quickly get there, but let me try
It's
and
all right.
do it
Talk
verbally.
while we both
Yes.
looking for it.
It is a platform elevated on, I think it's 5 steel legs or aluminium legs, and it is a circular. It's a circular thing that
Right.
you walk up to, and you look into the middle of the circle like a big elevated donut. You look down into the workings where the paleontologists are looking at. That's the Malapasine. That's where Australopithecus sediba was discovered.
Right.
And as a visitor, you would look down. You don't touch the land at all. And that whole structure is sitting on these 5 legs, which are held by 5 bolts. Those bolts are as big as my thumb. And so the entire impact on the environment is 5 bolts as big as my 5 thumbs holding the whole thing together. Now, it's marvelous because the platform can actually shift around slightly. If they move their area of interest, you can move
Right.
the platform a little bit. It's the architect who designed it describes it as a mirror. You're actually looking into the past, and the past is looking up at you because that's where humans evolved from. It's got a lot of symbolism. It's an architectural wonder. It was all assembled first on a rugby ground somewhere else where he could test all of these things, and then it was brought and they put it down and virtually didn't move a tree or a leaf or a rock or anything. It is a wonderful piece of environmental sensitivity, actually. I was gobsmacked by the thing.
Given the penchant of people to blow things up and then put new things in place, it's like, let's explode this and then we can put the bolts in. We've blown up half of the evidence. There are bits of Australopithecus scattered to the 4 corners of the earth now, but don't worry about those. We'll find others.
Yes, no, you're quite right. And of course, the thing that I often argue about, all of these caves were discovered because lime miners were digging out the lime. Those beautiful stalagmites and stalactites and so on in the caves were just taken out and dynamited and burned into lime, which was turned into cement or gold extraction. Most of it went to the gold mines. And a lot of people say, well, we would never have discovered these origins of human evolution if it hadn't been for the miners. Well, I say nonsense. Humans are very inquisitive. We would have found these caves anyway without the help of the dynamite and the destruction. Can you imagine how much of our ancestral history has been dynamited and turned into cement? And that's what happened. Thousands of these fossils, millions of these fossils were destroyed.
But if you think about it, in the early Americas, lots of their history ended up in cement or in foundations of buildings. If you crossed the right people or the wrong people.
Yes, no, I'm afraid it's a story of humankind. But the flip side of that is that it makes it a wonderful jigsaw puzzle that they're still trying to put together. You asked earlier if there's more work to be done. We actually don't know which of these various species of fossils were the ancestors of each other. Right. So that whole lineage is still got to be discovered. And you find one fossil every 10 years or something that is significant. And it's a very slow process, but they're putting together pieces of the puzzle. And the trouble is they don't have the box for that jigsaw puzzle with the picture on the cover. They don't know what they're looking for, frankly. So it's a really slow and a very deliberate process. I see you've got Philip up again.
Yeah, Vincent, I have a sneaking suspicion. You know that there are, for the jigsaw puzzle aficionados, there are single color jigsaw puzzles. In other words, the jigsaw puzzle doesn't have a picture. It's just a color. Yeah. So what they've got is they've got one of those where it's just colors, and they don't know how they've now got to put just a plain image together. Was Homo naledi the last significant find there?
Yes, that is the most recent one, and it is also one of the most interesting because Homo naledi is in some respects very primitive. It has quite a small brain, but it also has quite a lot of human attribute, or things that humans have, aspects to it that humans have. And its most remarkable thing is that it was found in a very, very deep, inaccessible cave. And I think a lot of your viewers will know the story that Lee Berger was told about this cave. He was told there are a lot of bones littered in this cave, but he couldn't get there himself. The access to that cave is limited to small people, frankly. So he put out an advertisement worldwide, and said, qualified paleoanthropologists or anthropologists who are small enough to fit in, please apply for work, because I need a team. And he built up this team, and Marina Elliott, who is a co-author and helper of mine on this book, she's the leader of this team. She's one of the very few human beings who can get in and look at this thing. And in this very, very inaccessible and incidentally very dangerous cave to try and get into anyway, the floor is littered with bones which are not fully fossilized yet. They're younger than the other fossils. They're in fact, it is very possible that this is Homo naledi, this particular species, was contemporaneous with human beings, Homo sapiens, because they're more or less the same sort of time of period of time. The other interesting thing, that in that cave, there is nothing else. Now, everywhere else you find fossils of other animals that fell into the caves and became fossilized. So you get, wolves and hyenas and all sorts of funny things in the other caves. In this one, there's nothing except Homo naledi, and lots of them. They've taken out something like 1,500 pieces of fossil, making up several or many different individual Homo naledi, little animals. But nothing else, not another thing, no stone tools, nothing to indicate why they were there. And there is this very contentious speculation that this was a kind of a burial site, or a place where bodies were chucked, either ceremoniously or not, but they were dumped there. That's one of the theories that has been put out. All sorts of other theories are there as well, and people argue endlessly. And it's a wonderful argument, because there's no immediate answer. You can't get to the right answer yet. But Lee Berger, the lead paleontologist on that site, believes that this could have been a burial site. And I think as time goes by, he's going to discover other things that either prove or disprove his thesis.
Now, we mentioned Prof. Tobias. You and I were chatting about the professor just before we came to air. And we differ on this particular image, because this is a statue just outside the caves, and people are told to rub his nose for good luck. And I wish they just patted him on the head or corrected his tie or something. Or somebody goes back and just blends his nose in with the rest of his face, because I'm not sure if Philip would be happy about looking this way. He was such a proud man.
Yeah, I think probably you're right. It's a little bit undignified, frankly. And Philip was a very dignified man. So you're probably right. I just thought that he might have enjoyed the fame because people are rubbing his nose to get his wisdom. But, I don't know why they don't polish the whole thing, because it's a bronze. It's a bronze statue, and it would, a bit of brasso, and the whole thing would probably come right anyway. But it's the thing about him is that, one of the tragedies of Sterkfontein caves is that the very first Australopithecus africanus was discovered not in Sterkfontein actually, but in Taung, and that triggered this whole thing about where human origins lay. And it was then realized that they lay in Africa. The origins of humanity are in Africa. But there was a fraud out there called the Piltdown Man, which was a fake fossil that had been discovered in England.
That's right.
And the acceptance of Dart's discovery of the first Australopithecus, and then Robert Broom, who really did a lot more work discovering all the South African fossils in those days. But their work was kind of belittled by this fake. For 40 years, the best paleoanthropologists in the world were accepting this thing, and it was what it was a human skull that had been stressed and managed to look like a fossil, and then had been joined onto an orangutan jaw. And this fooled the scientists for 40 years, the European scientists. Now, that in a way was tragic because it ended up with, when eventually it was revealed in 1953, I think, somebody, and funnily enough, it was a South African scientist working in England, who said, hey, this thing is nonsense. And then it was revealed, but it was too late because Robert Broom had died. All his work, he never saw his work realized. He had no doubt about his own work, but he never saw it recognized internationally. And then soon after 53, of course, South Africa went into isolation, as it were, because of apartheid, and our science was not recognized by other academics. And so we were sort of out on a limb and isolated. And going back to Tobias, what he did was keep the science alive. He kept people working in those caves and discovering new stuff, and wonderful things were discovered. The first use of fire, for example, which is a very important development in human evolution, that was discovered by Bob Brain in the Sterkfontein area. All sorts of stuff was done. And Philip Tobias, as the head of the department at Wits, kept that thing on the boil all of that time. He also worked with the East African people who were getting the limelight by then, and kept South Africa on the map. And then, of course, in 94, when we got back onto the international scene, Sterkfontein was there for the realization of these latest discoveries. And we've been talking about Homo naledi, but the other important thing was Ron Clark's discovery of Australopithecus Prometheus, which is called Littlefoot. That's its thing. Right. That's another wonderful story, and that is the complete, almost complete skeleton of a very, very early ancestor of humanity. So there have been wonderful discoveries there, and it's largely because Philip Tobias, in those dark years of apartheid, kept things going. He also almost ended up in jail himself because he was a very anti-apartheid activist.
I think that Piltdown Man was the first recorded evidence of misinformation. The stuff that we're seeing on a regular basis now with the virus and all that type of thing. Vincent, we've come to the end of our time. Unfortunately, there's so much more I want to talk to you about, but I want people to go out and buy the book. It's called Cradle of Life. It's a story of Magaliesberg and the Cradle of Humankind. It's published by Strake Nature, who do some wonderful work publishing a variety of different book guides. So all it leaves me to do is to say thank you so much for being a guest on In Conversation With.
Well, thank you very much.
My guest today, Vincent Carruthers. We were talking about Cradle of Life, story of the Magaliesberg. If you want to see who else have been guests on In Conversation With, why don't you subscribe to my YouTube channel? It's called In Conversation With, and there are over 100 guests that you can choose from.